I follow them and look to them for the love of it. I'm not a professional scholar in any regard, certainly not in space. And so with that in mind, if any of my understanding of space or the moon in particular is off, please do feel free to come up after and correct me. Or if you happen to be a C.S. Lewis scholar or a Dante scholar, I also welcome your remarks. But I will say that one of the things as someone who does this, in what I find the little time that I have, my interest in C.S. Lewis and in Dante are centered in something that I think a lot of us, whether or not we're interested in space or not, need. Structure, order, and a word that will come up quite a bit tonight, harmony, how things relate to other things. And I find that the cosmology, the understanding of the world and the heavens above, is the thing in which we most look to Lewis and to Dante and see in them the thing that is most beneficial to our own lives, even where we sit today. Have you ever dreamt of going to space, desired it, pursued it, imagined, as I have, yourself aboard Apollo 13, jet engines propelling you far out into the sky, humming Elton John's Rocket Man, departing into all that cold and all that dark, into a voyage in the outer edges of the galaxy? Have you ever sought to discover new worlds? If you gather the most brilliant and introspective minds of the 14th and 15th and 16th and 17th, 18th centuries, and you put them in a room, and you tell them the tale of space exploration in the last 60 years, and they would blink with incredulity. Now, modern people, such as you and I, we've always had a quaint deal of fun with our ancestors, their earthbound perspective and sophomoric technology, superstitions about the human body and understanding of Earth and biology. We have subconsciously patted them on the knee and ourselves on the back, and we've thanked our lucky stars that we aren't stuck back in those dark ages. Science, technology, the age of reason has freed us from the shielded and superstitious minds of the medievals, with their ignorance, reliance on scholastical authority, now in the rearview mirror, armed with the powers of empirical observation, data analysis, AI. Now we hold the key to knowledge, to rationality. If space is, as that Harry Caray segment was on SNL, the infinite frontier, then it's merely just the undiscovered country. And why should we not, as the brave explorers that we are, use the technology we have to forge new paths, discover new worlds? Like the American pioneers, setting off to the west, though the frontier is dangerous and unpredictable, though violent and unforgiving and unsettling, only for the daring of spirit, of course, we go, not gently, into that cold, dark night. In the opening credits of one of my favorite modern movies about space, Gravity, the following words appear on the screen. At 600 kilometers above planet Earth, Americans, that's 370 miles, the temperature fluctuates between 258 and negative 148 degrees Fahrenheit. There's nothing to carry sound, no air pressure, no oxygen. Life in space is impossible. Now, this is not a sentiment that is uttered by one screenwriter or director. This is factual data, after all. Space is not the place for life. It's cold. It is dark. It is unforgiving. And to date, science, TM, has discovered no real intelligent life there. But for the medieval, space is not merely an unknown term, not due to any lack of intelligence on their part, but because that region was not seen as the uninhabited. It was not seen as an untamed frontier or a place where nothing could live, but instead was a place of order, harmony, closeness to the Creator, and of the divine knowledge. To the medieval mind, space as a term for the heavens is vulgar. A common misconception about medievals is that they didn't understand space or physics. You may have heard someone say that people in the Dark Age thought that Earth was flat. They didn't. All mildly educated people believed that the Earth was round. They did not know that the Earth was not indeed the center of the universe. That is true. And the reason for thinking that was not to their inflated sense of self as earthbound beings, but rather truly to a lack of perspective. A perspective which, had they possessed it, almost certainly would have done more to enhance their previous understanding of the world rather than undermine it. I'm speaking, of course, of Copernicus' discovery that we live in a solar system in which the sun is the center and Earth revolved around it. But medievals can be forgiven for this ignorance, much in the same way that those of you who wear spectacles can be forgiven for not being able to read your program without assistance. It's not your fault, you see. Or you don't see, but you know. You have eyes, and you use them well, but without the corrective lenses, you will not be able to decipher the symbols on the page. So their system of ordering and placement and arrangement of the planetary movements then is not a matter of thinking that Moscow, Pennsylvania is in Russia, but just in putting it further away from Scranton on the map than where it belongs. A good deal of work has been done in recent decades about the myth of medieval illiteracy, recognizing that while, yes, millions of souls were indeed born and then died, having never learned to read or to write, or conjugate a verb, diagram a sentence, they did, however, have a knowledge base. If you could forgive the flawed analogy, like a bushel that's completely full of a very small variety of apples. They had a collection of objects just from a very limited set of sources, and yet their bucket was just as deep, just as wide as ours. Well, we can collect the balanced diet of the food pyramid, although hopefully with fewer carbs. Their knowledge of many things was reasonably seasonal and regional, and what could be handed over by whatever learned person was in their immediate vicinity. Lewis notes then in his work, one that you will hear mentioned many times tonight, The Discarded Image, when he says that the medievals were extremely bookish but just had limited sources, that they had, in a word you'll hear again quite a bit tonight, auteurs, a word that means a few things, but perhaps it might be most related to our term master. Think here of the master craftsman, the master electrician, the one who has mastered something, and those who would apprentice under the master, those who would seek the knowledge necessary to build a home, to wire a radio, they would consult the master. The medievals did have low literacy levels, but their auteurs were literate. And not only literate, but scholarly. Lewis says in The Discarded Image, "The peculiar predicament of a medieval man was in fact just this. He was a literate man, but he had lost a great many of his books, and he had forgotten how to read all of his Greek books. He worked with the rather chance selection that he has." Lewis compared medievals to a party of shipwrecked people saying to work, try to build up a culture on an uninhabited island, and just depending on whatever odd collection of books washed up on the shore. So in other words, what the medieval person knew, they knew well. And with the knowledge that they had, they saw in it the connective tissue between things. That in what was made, made sense. Another thing that the medievals had was the church. This, again, to a modern person, might seem to be a pejorative, but the church actually did help to make sense of the world in a way that a more formal education, even if it had been accessible, may not have. Think about the liturgy of even ancient Hebrew temple worship. Think about hearing and the repetition of the spoken text, or the recognizing of the symbolic apparel and the motions and the movement. The way that an animal sacrifice painted a very literally colorful picture of the nature of the connection between one's actions and personal behavior and their associated costs. In the medieval church, you not only have those same texts, but you also have the New Testament. You have St. Paul, years of commentary by theologians, then the practice of the Eucharist, the understanding of symbols and of stories, time past and present, prescriptive communication, contemplative pondering. This all would have been the experience of the medieval worshiper. But then if you were to add to that the cathedral, the picture of the heavens would open to you as well. The building itself would communicate in a way that the priest or the reader of the Eucharist could not. From the orientation of the cathedral, east to west, to direct prayer towards Jerusalem, to the amount of light, the direction of the light, the colors that the light produced on the wall, the art, the tapestries, apologies to Presbyterians, the statuary, of course, the incomparable stained glass. These all would have been made to tell the story of creation and redemption to the world of the illiterate masses. In the Gothic cathedral, you have vaulted ceilings and arches, and flying buttresses, and these were meant to allow not merely the passage of light, but to cause the worshiper to look up, to gaze heavenward, even indoors, and to see heaven coming down. Glenn Sunshine has written of the Gothic cathedral that it is intended to be a picture and a foretaste of heaven, lifting you above this mundane world, reminding you that the world is much bigger than what you can see here. In the cathedral, he says, heaven and earth, time and eternity intersect. The cathedral is the earthly extension of the heavenly sanctuary, the place where God and humanity meet. Beyond all this, however, the most important possession that the medieval mind could claim is not merely the depth of these limited sources of knowledge, nor the object of their experiences, while being technically illiterate. The medieval mind was at the height of its powers in the way that it could organize what it could observe. Think of Lewis's analogy, the party of shipwrecked people, and the chance collection of books. We should see in that another element of the medieval mind, in that they were able to somehow, with that collection, harmonize what they had. How is harmony possible when it emerges from conflicting sources? Lewis observed that early Christians and classical pagan cultures were not as contradictory as are now assumed, and that there were some inherent links between them, especially at the deep level. Tertullian, perhaps you've heard it before, he made the famous line, what has Athens to do with Jerusalem? But even for him, in the rest of his writings, the incompatibility between the classical and the ecclesiastical traditions was just not as far as it seemed. It's not radical what he thought about their ability to work together. Others after Tertullian endorsed the idea that the seeds of the Logos, the living word, they were sown in the hearts of all human beings, especially in the philosophers and the prophets. And so in that sense, Socrates was striving for Christ even before Christ's incarnation. Natural religion, classical philosophy, Judaism, these were all recognized as stages in the development toward the Christian gospel. Now, it would be an error to just stop at one of the early stages, but nevertheless, it assumed that there was fundamental common ground between the ancient, classical, and ecclesiastical in terms of their yearning for the truth. And then the yearning for the truth provided the possibility for medieval authors to synthesize, harmonize anything that was heterogeneous. It did so with their model. But Lewis also pointed out that there is a unique disposition of the medieval person that enabled the accomplishment of this enormous task. Such a medieval person, Lewis said, was an organizer, a codifier, and a builder of systems. The medieval person wanted a place for everything and everything in its right place. Now, I am, as Jared said, a married man. I'm here to tell you that in this regard, my wife is very medieval. And this penchant for finding the place and the position of things even applied to the heavens. The heavens were a place to examine, see these objects next to each other, see how they belonged in the grander tapestry that we're seeing, as well as the individual characteristics of each object observed. And while moderns have made many more discoveries, in other words, they found more bushel baskets, moderns have struggled to find one of the main things that the medieval mind could find. It's clarity. The prime source for an understanding of the clarity of the medieval mind is Dante Alighieri, the Italian poet. In the late Middle Ages, Dante wrote the Divine Comedy, an epic poem that lives up to its genre, not only for his brilliant command of poetic imagery without the downside of verbosity, but also for the poem's sheer scope, sense of purpose, from the opening line to the closing one. You know where you're going, you know where you've been, there's no doubt about it. Dante is Lewis's auteur, his master here. It's his world building, Dante's, that Lewis uses to shape his own story of the heavens. In order to fully understand the connection between Dante and Lewis, I think we should look just a bit at the comedy, just to get our bearings. You have in your bulletin, and I kind of knew when I sent this image, when I sent all of these images, I kind of knew that this would work out this way, so I probably should have sent a different image. So, this is not totally off guard, but you have these images here, and I think, considering, we'll be able to work with them, but I do apologize. They're not perfect considering the contrast here, but inside the bulletin, the one that has, these two images on it, if you look at that for a second. The one on the left, this is Dante's understanding of the cosmos. In particular, we're going to look at the non-terrestrial portions. Okay, that is what you would find, the terrestrial portions that is, that's what you would find mostly detailed in the Inferno and in the Purgatorio, the second of the three books. But once Dante, and I assume that you're familiar with him, but also I'm not going to get into too much detail about the specifics of those two books, but if you know that Dante travels in the Inferno to hell, rises Mount Purgatorio in the second, and then eventually into the heavens himself in the third, the heavens being our major topic of concern today, I want to note that you can see that they are organized in spheres. As you probably know, it's not how those planets really work, and that's not really how it is. And yet, Dante is referring to the Ptolemaic system. It's pre-Copernican. And medieval scholars would have had lots of other things to use to measure distance between stars, nature of stars. They had some understanding of things, but they worked with what they had. And as such, Dante builds his world on these heavens because of the way that the nature of each of the planets, characteristics and traits, work with the story that he was trying to tell in his narrative poem. The idea adopted by Dante here is a cosmos with the earth at its center, surrounded by the heavens, and then together, you can see, sort of, outside of the earth, the hemisphere of water and air and fire, and then eventually you get to the sphere of the moon. goes up from there. Mercury, Venus, the Sun, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn. Then you get into the sphere of the fixed stars, and then the crystalline sphere, the primordial. And then, eventually, after primordial, you get into the Empyrean. This is where God resides. So Dante's heaven and hell, they reflect this hierarchical structure he would have received from Aristotle. So the heavens, as you ascend further up, away from earth, closer you get to God himself, the heavens each become a degree of perfection better. And then at the center, which not easy to tell in this image, but at the center, everything that's heavy and earth-like is drawn in, and appropriately in the Inferno, the last cantos of the Inferno, we find Satan himself, as far away as possible from God as he can be. God as far out as possible, Satan as far in the center of earth as possible. Now, what's the meaning of all this? Why does he use this? Why is this dated, as we know, not true picture, the framework on which he would build his poem? And then why would Lewis, who knew better, build his on top of that same framework? It's because for Dante, the heavens tell a picture of order in the universe. And because of this order, everything has meaning in multiple dimensions. And all of it integrates into a complex but a unified world. Lewis said of the medieval understanding of the cosmos that its contents, however rich and various, were always in harmony. So this would have rendered what Lewis called a tidy universe, one in which the supreme order of objects and ideas allow a modern author to come to them, see the symbols that are already there, and then fix their own symbols on top of them, to continue layering them. It won't detract from the original meaning. You buy into the original meaning. Whatever those symbols were, you stick your symbols on top of them, and then you build yours on it. It's literally a blank canvas of which the sides are drawn, and all of the parts of the canvas that you would expect to see, the image that you had seen there before, still there, but then you're adding color and detail to it, and all of the meaning that was already there makes your colors brighter. So Lewis takes this medieval model, this model of clarity, the Ptolemaic universe of meaning, Dante as his guide, as Dante had Virgil in the Commedia, and then he writes his own fictional tale of the universe. He takes the reader to Mars, to Venus, and then back to Earth again, to see the divine mysteries revealed in our own interplanetary adventure. So, on to Lewis. While we look to see Lewis's medieval and his galactic qualities, I think for the literary-minded person who may be here, much more can be explained in this vein simply by reading Michael Ward's book, Planet Narnia. So in that book, Ward more or less has uncovered that Lewis was hiding in plain view his medieval model of the seven heavens in the form of the seven-book Chronicles of Narnia series. Has anyone heard of that book or read it before? You know what I'm talking about. It's just an absolute must-read book for the Narnia fan, for the Lewis fan. And even a lover of Narnia is going to be blown away by the way that Ward reveals things that we thought that we knew what we were seeing and we weren't seeing. So, but his book, Planet Narnia, was also instrumental in this talk too, especially because of his identification of the planetary influences within the Ransom trilogy. But that Narnia revelation is most spectacular. But Ward also was able to identify in the back image, which is actually a pretty nice looking image, the field of Arbel. Now this is not completely unknown, if you look at that. And you might have heard me say the planet Narnia and the seven heavens, and you might be wondering, what's the seven heavens? I thought there were 9 heavens or 10 heavens in Dante, and what's the 7 heavens? Well, I understand it's a little confusing. But on the field of Arbel, illustration here in the back, you can see the very weird names for planets that you probably thought you knew which ones that they were, but then they kind of throw you off. And then you can see the sun and the moon on there as well. those are the same 7 heavens of the Ptolemaic system in medieval cosmology. So you get Mercury, you get Venus, Sun, Mars, Jupiter, the Moon, of course, and Saturn. Those are the 7. And then Dante just adds those other, the crystalline sphere and the prima mobile and the Empyrean beyond that to get to the 10. But Lewis, though living in the post-Copernican understanding of the planets, he saw the same order and meaning in Dante's system and used that as a better framework to build a story. And so in Dante, everything from the moon down is mutable, changeable, subject to the influence of time, the elements, fire, water, air. And then each of the other planets above, they were thought to have intelligences or deities that were associated with them. But the Earth was not believed to have any intelligence associated with it, not because we're not intelligent, but because it was not thought the Earth moved. And so therefore she didn't require any guidance. So Lewis, he plays into that medieval understanding when in his story we discover that Earth is the silent planet. The first book of Lewis's trilogy, Out of the Silent Planet. Why is Earth the silent planet? Well, because our planet was infected by sin. The bent one, the villain, ultimate villain of the story, a satanic figure, which later prompts the Christ figure of the story, Lewis calls Maladil, to come to Earth. In Lewis's story, the hero is Dr. Elwyn Ransom, a philologist. Tolkien fan in the room may recognize that term, but it's an academic who studies ancient languages, largely through their literary references. And while many of Lewis's references are terrestrial and recognizable, Ransom, his hero, discovers that the language of the universe outside of Earth is Old Solar. That the planets' true names are not what we think of, Venus and Mars, Sol and Luna, but Arbel, Solva, the sun and the moon, and Paralandra, Venus, and Malacandra, Mars. Also, Lewis incorporates the medieval scope of the heavens into his work too. The medievals had no real conception of travel to the planets, or to stars, or even the distance to or between them. But again, they were not ignoramuses. To them, the heavens were vast, but they were intelligible. They were vast, but they were intelligible, and therefore limited. One more thing to note about Lewis's conception of the cosmos. There is an important medieval term called the Great Dance. How things in the universe interact and interconnect, including beings. For example, when the planets orbit the sun, they are said to be dancing with one another. Now you can sort of see this in the program. This one, the black one, this is meant to illustrate dancers before the threshold. An idea that Lewis talks about that comes from the concept that the figure of scattered dots that you see there around the rings, which you can't really see. Do you know what those are? Do you know your planets? Those are asteroids. That's the asteroid belt there. And those outer edges of our now century-long experiment into outer space travel, we observed moons and asteroids. Lewis, through the medievals, saw that as dancers. What are the dancers doing? Are they entertaining us? Are they looking in on us, watching what we do and moving? No. They're looking out. They're dancing before the threshold of the real Empyrean, the real heavens, out, not in. So in other words, even if all those things are moving around the sun, they are, but even if they are, they're actually moving as a result of something that's further outward. They are in what Lewis calls deep heaven, where God resides immaterially and not in one fixed place. To him, all of the outsides of the belts are forward. There's a term which is not original to Lewis, but that he uses to describe the movement of the asteroids, the dancers before the threshold. And he calls it kindly inclining. It's a picture of willful and happy submission to the authority of the first mover. This figure plays prominently in the trilogy, especially the final book, which is about marriage, but that's a talk for another time. What makes this idea even more fascinating is that on the other side of this asteroid belt, and I know you can't see it here, but maybe at the very bottom, if you squint, you can see Jupiter. It's there. Between Jupiter and the asteroid belt was another belt, the Kuiper belt, which wasn't even discovered until 1992, almost 30 years after Lewis died. More dancers. And Jupiter, though a mere 493 million miles away from the sun, can be easily seen without the aid of a telescope. Has anyone seen Jupiter under a telescope? Have you seen Jupiter under a telescope? It's amazing. There is a red dot on Jupiter. There's a red dot. If you look through a telescope, you can make out a red dot. The red dot is twice as large as Earth. And it has rings, like Saturn. Jupiter has rings. They've discovered them. In the last 30 years, they've discovered it has rings. And they're so far away that we can't see them. For the entirety of human history, until 1979, no one knew that Jupiter had rings. What is the meaning of this? For the person of faith, I see that, and to me, Jupiter stands as an opportunity to wonder at the majesty of God. Because until 1979, he's the only person who ever saw them. If we believe that God created the heavens and the earth, that the heavens declare his glory, all of the heavens are telling his story. And yet, same God who made Jupiter with the rings, also, in a particular time, in a particular place, became flesh and dwelt among us. I mentioned deep heaven before. I just want to return to that just for a few minutes to look at it closer. Lewis's most targeted words on the entire subject of space come from the first book of the Ransom trilogy, Out of the Silent Planet. And while it is usually the death of a talk or even a paper to quote very extensively from one work, I think hearing what Lewis says in the unvarnished way that he says it in the voice of his main character, Ransom, will help us understand one of the failures of the modern imagination as it regards space. So, buckle in. Ransom on his way toward Mars in the first book. And if you haven't read it, I'm not really spoiling for you that Ransom goes to Mars in book 1, and that even though it seems like he may die, he does live because there's a book 2 and there's a book 3. You know how sequels work, right? So he makes it. He's okay. It's shaky for a minute, but he makes it. Well, on his way to Mars in book 1, his first experience of being in space is this. Quote, he had read of space. At the back of his thinking for years had lurked the dismal fantasy of the black, cold vacuity, the utter deadness, which was supposed to separate the worlds. He had not known how much it affected him until now. Now that the very name, space, seemed blasphemous libel for this empyrean ocean of radiance in which they swam. He could not call it dead. He felt life pouring into him from it at every moment. He had thought it barren. He now saw that it was the womb of the worlds, whose blazing and innumerable offspring looked down nightly, even upon the earth with many eyes. And here, with how many more? No. Space was the wrong name. Older thinkers had been wiser when they named it simply the heavens which declared the glory of God. Later, on his return trip from Mars, in the moment of uncertainty of arriving back to Earth in one piece, Lewis then has Ransom say this: could not feel that they were an island of life journeying through an abyss of death. This is him aboard the spaceship. Ransom felt almost the opposite, that life was waiting outside the little iron eggshell in which they rode, ready at any moment to break in, and that if it killed them, it would kill them by an excess of its vitality. He hoped passionately that if they were to perish, they would perish by the unbodying of the spaceship and not by suffocation from within it. To be let out, to be free, to dissolve into the ocean of eternal noon seemed to him at certain moments a consummation even more desirable than returning to Earth. If he had felt some such lift of the heart when he first passed through the heavens on their outward journey, he felt it now tenfold. For now he was convinced that the abyss was full of life in the most literal sense, full of living creatures. Lewis is firmly planting his feet in the medieval sense of Earth's position at the center of everything. Again, not being a condition of self-centeredness, but rather a prestige place from where we can look out and up and see from our vantage point all of the life and the truth that is above us every night. The final quote from Lewis on Deep Heaven. He wondered how he could ever have thought of the planets, even of Earth, as islands of life and reality floating in a deadly void. Now, with a certainty which never after deserted him, he saw the planets, the Earths he had called them in his thought, as mere holes or gaps in the living heaven, excluded and rejected wastes of heavy matter and murky air, formed not by addition to, but subtraction from the surrounding brightness. Another way, we have heaven, but another way that Lewis's Ransom trilogy is a kind of telling of the medieval story is by joining together two common medieval characteristics. You have the medieval romance and the pilgrimage. If you've read the Ransom novels, you know that the adventures are far more about the journey than the destination. And having no known goal, the journey becomes a unique mixture of quest and pilgrimage. But Lewis is re-mythologizing of these ancient and medieval ideas as part of what makes his work so special. And I also find the way that he engages with the ideas that he criticizes, rather than just to repudiate them, he builds on them. I find it very refreshing, very unmodern. So in other words, while being deeply critical of the modern man, he also adapts the medieval to serve the modern. His work is both a response to and also a transfiguration of modern science fiction tales and the ideologies that undergird them. He notoriously hated H.G. Wells, and a lot of what he's writing, it's just him trying to get under Wells' skin. But he's really trying to speak to Wells' audience and show them the medieval way, how the medievals saw, and what you're missing in these ideologies. But nevertheless, his books are always in contact with both the past and the present. He does not feel, even in the slightest, dated in the Ransom trilogy. As I mentioned before, the first book of the trilogy, Out of the Silent Planet, he's full ode to Dante in that book. Ransom, the hero, he's a middle-aged bachelor. He's found in the beginning of the book walking in the middle of a road, which immediately brings to mind the opening lines of the Inferno. Midway through the journey of our life, I found myself within a dark forest. Out of the Silent Planet spares us Dante's grisly detail and descent into hell, but the allusions to that trilogy do abound, especially in Paralandra, the second book of the trilogy, and it has a sort of spiritual relationship with the Purgatorio, the second book of Dante's trilogy. But here on Mars, in Out of the Silent Planet, Ransom must learn to become martial, that is, a holy warrior. a man who must learn the fighting spirit that is sometimes necessary in order to just do the hard right thing. He gets an opportunity to employ what he learns on Mars later when he goes to Venus in the second book of the trilogy, Perelandra. So while Ransom learns the manly arts of virtuous violence and doing the hard right thing, he also learns about the greater interplanetary story that involved the beings that exist not only on other planets, but the divine guides who oversee them, including Earth's lack of a guide, where he discovers that Earth is the only one that doesn't have an intelligence because of the Bent One's foray. But Earth, Tholkandra, is seen as blessed. It is the only world in which Maladil, the Christ figure, came to in the form of the Earthlings. So then, with this under his belt, he moves on to Perelandra, the second book. It has even more references that he'll layer on top of Dante. Here, Lewis is making the English poet John Milton his auctor, his master, and he's drawing on Milton's Paradise Lost in thematic coupling, so as to consider the nature of man before his fall. In his book, Reflections on the Psalms, I have to say, Lewis's worst book, and that's not hard that's not easy to say, but it really is. He, almost in passing, talking about Psalm 19, mentions that he was worried that space travel could lead to the spread of Earth's contamination of other worlds. And then we learn that that's essentially exactly what happens in Perelandra. That's what happens. He wrote in that, his quote was, he was afraid that space travel would distribute upon new worlds the vomit of our own corruption. So he explores this idea in Perelandra, which is his name for Venus, Old Solar for Venus. But unlike Out of the Silent Planet, where Ransom is taken to Mars against his will, in this book, he goes as a willing participant to Venus. He goes there under Maladil's orders. So here, Lewis looks through Milton and the modern scientific lens to explore not only the nature of mankind, but the nature of femininity, love, and a revisiting of the garden. In many ways, it resembles other paradises, Perelandra. It's a garden, but it's different in more watery ways. So there's the Garden of Eden, and perhaps if you know your Greek myths, the Garden of Hesperides. They're gardens that are completely unpolluted by human affairs, uncontaminated, as Lewis says. The Garden of Hesperides gets broken into from the outside, but Eden, in the original Genesis account, falls from within. The sins of the inhabitants cause its fall. Milton recognizes and highlights this biblical sense of alien contamination embodied in the character of his serpent in Paradise Lost. He explicitly gives the serpent the spirit of Satan. It's broken out of hell and into the unfallen created world. In a similar way in Perelandra, Weston, the villain of the Ransom trilogy, he breaks into Perelandra, not causing the planet to fall with his own sins, but attempting to plant the seed of sin in Tinadril, the green lady of Perelandra, or Perelandra's version of Eve. Ransom only learns halfway through the book what his mission is. It's to stop Weston. So while Ransom's travel to Venus is a kind of medieval pilgrimage, following in that vein, it also serves as a kind of romantic quest for him. Not really Ransom for Tinadril, not exactly, but it is an exploration of love, both agape and eros, as well as a kind of purgation of the soul in complete submission to Maladil. And here's where the connection to Dante's Purgatorio happens. The Perelandrian landscape is littered with imagery and symbolism of medieval stories, far too broad, too beautiful to even label here. And to even mention Perelandra without getting into depth doesn't know justice. The climax, if you haven't read it, is, in my humble opinion, some of Lewis's finest writing. and is also incredibly cathartic and satisfying. So I won't spoil it for you, just go read it. But alas, within the imagery, focus on the landscape and the water. My wife, love her, she just whines about all of the imagery of why are they looking at this and why is the water moving here. It's all important. It's all there. And it's all to show the continuity between the elements of the worlds. The same way that Dante's hierarchical system of the heavens worked. Lewis is speaking clearly and mythically in Perelandra in a way that you cannot perceive unless you look at all of the layers. The final book of Ransom's trilogy is That Hideous Strength. And I will not spoil it for you if you haven't read it. Just so you know, it's just a hand grenade dropped into a box of dynamite. It's the war between the medieval and the modern on full display, front lines. And that said, it retains its medieval form of a medieval romance in the form of the book's central characters. Not Ransom this time. Mark and Jane Studdock, a couple who've made a muddle of their own romance. They are both in some ways on romantic pilgrimages, romantic quests. And here, Lewis's medievality comes out. Jane is on a quest to find her femininity, and Mark to find his masculinity. And before the alchemical wedding of the closing chapters of the book begins to be consummated, who shows up? Merlin, of course, just like you thought. So, I mean, if you've never read it, it's a bit of a spoiler, but honestly, it's just so weird that you're not even going to remember that I said that. You're just going to kid it. It's like you never even noticed it coming for the first time. So, but it's here in the final book of the series, Roots in Romance, that Lewis, while occasionally circling back to Dante's Paradiso and drawing on that, putting his layer of paint on the paint that's already there, he takes Arthur and he picks him up as his auteur and he follows after him. In this book, Ransom is in place as Arthur. And while Arthur is king, Arthur needs Merlin to help defeat the enemies of England. Again, Lewis takes a medieval text of order, an already contained meaning, and then he harmonizes it by layering on corresponding meaning with different texts. And the end of the book, the last book of the trilogy, is a transformation of Mark and Jane, the couple, the marriage, which follows the order of the stars, and both Mark and Jane, as Lewis says, kindly incline to each other in their respective created orders. So where does this all leave us? Medieval people did not share savage, pre-logical beliefs, growing out of a spontaneous response to the environment. Nor was their belief system dominated by church authority alone. Rather, in the medievals, there was an overwhelmingly bookish character, as Lewis says, and in the medieval culture, they were not in the age only of the church's authority, but of authority, capital A, period. From the pagan myths to the monasteries, the belief in external authority, of which, whether it was omniscient, omnipotent, omnipresent, or if it was just regional, or limited to a tree or a stream that a nymph lived in, all people recognized, indeed saw, in the natural world, in the sky, in the trees, in the air, in the fire, something bigger than themselves was at work in the world. And whatever that power was, be it Jehovah or Jupiter or Jesus, the power had a plan. The plan was beyond what could be observed with the eye, but you could see it with your eyes, that a plan was in place. And this is one of the main things that differentiate that period almost equally from the savagery that came before it and from our modern civilization. In the savage, I want you to think not what you're thinking, but instead of just the primitive community. A primitive community would be one where you absorb your culture, but you have no books. You have no auteur. You have no learned person in your community to follow. That's one extreme. But in the modern West, most knowledge depends on the last resort, observation alone. That is the empiricism of the scientific method. And on the data, data-driven, the word that you'll hear everywhere. They're suffering from what Lewis called chronological snobbery. It's a term for preferring the new over the old. And moderns have gradually discarded the aucteur. That's what he means when he talks about the discarded image, that idea that there was something that gave you a sense of order, but you've gotten rid of that. You've refused to acknowledge external authority. Only believe in what can be observed itself. So the medieval person that could be brought the year of our Lord, 2024, no doubt impressed by all the things that we've accomplished and built. But if you could look at our mind, the way that we think, my suspicion is that the medieval person would find that in the last half millennia, we've lost as much as we've gained. We have unlimited belief in our own abilities, but no ability to articulate what they actually are, how we can use them, or what our telos is. We're limited to the literal, factual. We're not limited because we can't see beyond it. Many modern people, even the secular, they find happiness and meaning and pleasure in metaphor. They see the image and the imagination in a thing, and they're willing to suspend disbelief just enough, so long as they recognize that it's just a story. The medieval man or woman brought here today would shout to us that the world is charged with the grandeur of God, and that all meaning is integrated in Christ. The medievals would tell us how the faithful and observable movements of the planets and stars around us are witnesses to a faithful creator, an artist who tells his story across moonbeams and galaxies, but also comes from the empyrean deep heaven to our planet, to our world, in the form of an infant, and is, on this day, presented in the temple like everyone else. The medievals would challenge us to see the heavens and the earth in the old ways, the true way. If we could only see, as they did, how the heavens themselves declare the glory of God. And when, if we, as many of our friends and colleagues and neighbors have, walked the middle road of our own lives, we've lost our way, realized all we needed to do to find it is to look up. I think that's what they would tell us.